Unknown Murray, Martha unknown. Unknown B. Cochrane, 5 unknown. Jean Campbell, Margaret Kelty, Catherine Manson, Janet Thompson, Marion Yule, several persons, Euphemia Dare, Agnes Aird, Margaret Allen, Janet Allen, Elspeth Alexander, Susanna Alexander, Agnes Anderson, Margaret Argyle, Margaret Octomuti, Janet Begbie, Elspeth Bailey, Susanna Bailey, Elspeth Bailey, Susanna Bailey, Margaret Ballantyne, Susanna Ballantyne, Margaret Baptiste, Margaret Barber, Margaret Barclay, Agnes Barhill, Margaret Bartan, Euphane Bartleman, Agnes Bartill, Isabel Bathgate, Christine Bell, Jonet Bell, Jonet Bell, Margaret Bell, Helen Belshys, Alison Berry, Catherine Black, Elizabeth Black, Elspeth Bruce, Thomas Black, Elspeth Blackie, Janet Blackie, Christian Black, Christian Black, Margaret Bower, Agnes Bowie, Isabel Brand, Helen Birkenrig, Isabel Brun, Margaret Brown, Bernard Brown, Agnes Brown, Jean Brown, Isabel Burney, Margaret Brutton, Margaret Bryson, Janet Buchanan, Margaret Burton, Margaret Butter, Isabel Cairns, Margaret Cant, Margaret Carvey, Janet Carvey, Helen Cass, Catherine Cass, Isabel Cathy, Patrick Cathy, Isabel Caldwell, Gaelish Charters, Elspeth Chibb, Janet Cleghorn, Janet Cock, Janet Caldine, Helen Conker, Maren Conan, Jean Cook, Helen Cothell, Catherine Copeland, Walter Cowan, Agnes Cowie, Elizabeth Crawford, Robert Crawford, Marion Craig, Elspeth Crawford, Isabel Crockett, Bessie Crockett, Catherine Cruikshanks, Margaret Curry, Janet Curry, Agnes Cuthbertson, Bessie Dawson, Christian Deans, Helen Deans, Isabel Dodds, Bessie Doughty, Janet Dahl, Margaret Dailies, Bessie Davidson, Jean Deans, Bessie Dixon, Janet Douglas, Margaret Elliott, Janet Ewell, Marjorie Farewell, Janet Fargreave, Isabel Ferguson, Bessie Flunkin, Bessie Fowler, Margaret Garvey, Jean Gaylor, Jean Getgood, Helen Gibson, Janet Gibson, Jean Gibson, Janet Gibson, Janet Gibson, Elspeth Graham, Janet Graham, Helen Gray, Janet Gray, Margaret Grieve, Elspeth Grinlaw, Marion Grinlaw, Margaret Grinton, Elspeth Guthrie, Helen Guthrie, Janet Hall, Margaret Hall, Elspeth Halliburton, Margaret Hadisad, John Harlow, Margaret Hart, Margaret Hartleman, Margaret Hall, Isabel Henderson, Janet Howitt, Margaret Hewingston, Margaret Hill, Agnes Hill, Janet Hipslop, Janet Hogg, William Hogg, Janet Holm, Barbara Hood, Barbara Horniman, Janet Howie, Janet Howison, Catherine Hunter, Jean Hunter, Margaret Hutchinson, Margaret Hindley, Marion Ingram, Agnes Johnson, David Johnson, Isabel Johnson, James Johnson, Catherine Johnson, Catherine Key, Margaret Key, Anna Kemp, Isabel Kerr, Janet Kerr, Margaret Kerr, William King, Bessie Knox, Jean Knox, Agnes Lawson, Elspeth Lawson, Catherine Leggett, Beatrice Leslie, Margaret Liddell, Margaret Little, Agnes Locke, George Lumsden, Janet Looney, Janet Lyle, Margaret Maislet, Janet Mason, Janet Matheson, Helen Mathy, Jean Mathy, Janet Mickelson, Elizabeth Miller, Janet Miller, Janet Miller, George Milton, Barbara Milne, George Milton, Bessie Moffat, Margaret Moffat, Elspeth Moffat, Jean Martin, John McMillan, Bessie Nicholson, Janet Nidry, Margaret Nisbet, Janet Peterson, Marion Peterson, Agnes Peterson, Christian Peterson, Elspeth Phillip, Janet Fumerson, Anna Pelmuir, Agnes Potgrieve, Adam Pollock, Catherine Porter, Margaret Porteous, Effie Pottith, Catherine Purdy, Marion Quithute, Margaret Rummage, Sarah Rummage, Isabel Ramsey, John Ramsey, Margaret Reed, John Rind, Margaret Ridd, Isabel Richardson, Adam Robertson, Catherine Robertson, Isabel Robinson, Janet Robson, Barbara Scott, Grizzle Scott, John Scott, Jonet Scott, Margaret Scott, Rot Scott, Isabel Shirey, Elizabeth Sinclair, Elizabeth Smith, Isabel Smith, Isabel Smythe, Isabel Smythe, Agnes Spark, Helen Spears, Isabel Steels, Nika Steels, Margaret Stevenson, Bessie Stewart, Janet Stoddart, Janet Stout, Isabel Sidray, Elspeth Taylor, Christine Thompson, Janet Thompson, Isabel Thompson, Bessie Torrig, Bessie Turnbull, Christian Ufferston, Margaret Veitch, Elspeth Fester, Christine Waterson, Margaret Walden, Margaret Walker, George Watson, Catherine Watson, Margaret Watson, Janet Watson, Janet Watt, James Welsh, Bessie Wilson, Christian Wilson, Janet Wilson, Janet Wilson, Marjorie Wilson, Thomas Wilson, Marion Wood, Margaret Wiley, Cuthbert Wind, Gilbert Wind, Elspeth Yester, Grizzle Young, Janet Young, Sarah Young, several women, several persons, unknown wife of Robert Weir, unknown Isabel F, unknown, 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 unknown. 3 or 4 witches. Janet Aith, John Aitken, Janet Allen, Agnes Allen, Elspeth Alexander, Helen Alexander, Janet Alexander, Janet And, Christian Anderson, Elspeth Anderson, Isabel Anderson, Archibald Baird, Mary Neen Bake, Helen Balfour, Christian Ballantyne, Susanna Ballantyne, Agnes Bappy, John Bartleman, Agnes Baxter, Robert Baxter, McCullen Begg, Alexander Bell, Elspeth Bell, Margaret Bell, Agnes Beveridge, Margaret Beveridge, Janet Binning, George Binney, Helen Burks, Christian Black, Marion Black, Isabel Blythe, Margaret Black, Janet Blythe, Elizabeth Black, Catherine Black, Isabel Blythe, James Bogg, John Boyg, Isabel Boyle, Christian Bonner, Christian Bauer, Janet Brehead, Agnes Brodie, Margaret Brodie, Marion Brown, Agnes Browns, John Browns, Elspeth Bruce, Agnes Birch, Agnes Burra, Janet Burnett, Elizabeth Burnett, Marion Burnett, Janet Burrell, Janet Neen Rory By, Robert Cappy, Isabel Cathy, Patrick Cathy, Janet Neen Shiel, Elspeth Chisholm, Janet Christie, Agnes Clark, Ninian Cowell, Mary McFinlay Vickham, Isabel Coundy, Elizabeth Glow, Barbara Contrington, Mary Neen Alexander Vic Contry, Matthew Connell, Catherine Neen Vic Connell, William Cowan, Elspeth Crackey, Janet Crawford, Christian Creef, Catherine Christell, Margaret Krause, Janet Christie, Marion Cumming, Catherine Ninan Vic Cullen, Christian Cumbertson, Jean Douglas, Christian Deans, Elizabeth Dempster, Janet Dewar, Edward Dixon, Jean Dixon, Marion Dixon, Mary Delore, Margaret Douglas, John Douglas, Agnes Drysdale, Margaret Drawn, Margaret Dryborough, Marilee Dunbar, Bessie Duncan, Margaret Duff, Isabel Duff, Jean Dunbar, Walter Dykes, Beak Neen Finlay, Vic Ain, Margaret Eddington, Margaret Edison, Janet Edward, Alexander Elder, Isabel Elder, George Ellis, Agnes Elphinston, Elspeth Faulkner, Elspeth Fermor, Elspeth Fleck, Janet Finlay, Beak Neen Du Vic Finlay, Ninian Dowie Vic Finlay, Thomas Finlayson, Beatrix Ford, Jean Foster, Barbara Fries, Bessie Fries, Isabel Fries, Catherine Frissell, Mary Frissell, Margaret Folkhart, Margaret Fife, Elspeth Galley, Margaret Garvey, John Gailey, Margaret Gibson, Elspeth Gilbert, Mary Neen John Vic Gilchrist, Muriel Du Nine Kilpatrick, Janet Gilroy, Isabel Gled, Isabel Gold, Communal Neen Duke Vic Country, Vic Goon, Isabel Gowdy, Mary Neen Gowan, Agnes Grant, Comrie Grant, Elspeth Gray, Christian Gray, Villette Gray, Marion Greenlaw, John Greer, Christian Grieve, John Grieve, Elizabeth Guthrie, Margaret Guthrie, Bessie Hay, Elspeth Hay, John Hay, Bessie Henderson, Annie Hayman, Amy Hindman, Janet Hurd, Melcy Hildrell, Janet Home, John Home, Barbara Honeyman, Janet Hood, Helen Hopkirk, Euphan Howen, Janet Howitt, Margaret Hutchinson, Margaret Huggin, Janet Howitt, Alexander Hunter, Anna Hunter, Bessie Hutchins, Agnes Hutchin, Gillies Hunton, Amy Hindman, Janet Hindman, Helen Ingalls, Helen Ilson, Barbara Innes, Mary Mowen, Vic Innish, Janet Isaac, Mally Johnson, Elspeth Johnson, Margaret Johnson, Margaret Kelly, Johnny Kemp, Jean Kerse, Joan Kerse, John Kincaid, Jean King, Margaret Curtin, Jean Kirkwood, Margaret Kiley, George Lacoste, Elspeth Laird, Bessie Lamb, Marie Lamont, Catherine Largsine, Helen Lauder, Isabel Lawson, Janet Lawson, Margaret Lawson, Anna Law, Alexander Lady, Walter Lady, Margaret Lech, Janet Liddell, Marion Lindsay, Margaret Lister, Janet Lowry, John Lyle, Beatrix Lyon, Elspeth Macbeth, Elspeth McHoman, Archibald Mann, Janet Mann, Marjorie Mann, Jean Manor, Janet Marr, Isabel Marshall, Jean Martin, Janet Martin, Isabel Mather, Jean Martin, William Martin, Margaret Matthey, David Meikle, Patrick Meikle, Alison Melville, Janet Merton, Janet Ninan Rory May, Elspeth Miller, Catherine Moore, Isabel Moore, Bessie Morrison, Janet Morrison, Janet Moore, Agnes Murray, Griselle Murray, James Murray, Janet Neil Donald, Vic William Vic Moore, Isabel McCann, Janet McCarter, Janet McLean, Janet McDonald McLean, Hector McLean, Janet McConkey, Catherine Neen Fairquhar McKean, Agnes McGilfrich, Margaret McLevin, Janet McMartin, Janet McIntyre, Isabel Moore McCaw, Marie McCaw, Patrick McCaw, Isabel McKendry, Margaret Mackenzie, Isabel McKesnock, Margaret McLean, Margaret McLevin, Isabel McNeil, Janet McNeil, Margaret McNichol, Isabel McNichol, Janet McNichol, Janet McNichol, Christian Neil, Farquhar Vic Ian Back McNeish, Margaret McNeish, Alistair McNevin, Mary McNevin, Donald McPhail, Margaret McPhail, Bessie Neal, Marie Moore McCull, Margaret McCulldye, Margaret McNeil, Isabel Nichol, Helen Nicholson, Elspeth McNeish, Violet Nimmo, Agnes Neen Donald Oig, Catherine Nine Owen Vic Omnush, Isabel Page, George Peterson, Margaret Patterson, Janet Patton, Bessie Peterkin, Christian Neen Fail, Margaret Phillip, Anna Pitmore, Agnes Pittenreek, Bessie Prophet, Christian Purdy, John Purdy, Agnes Query, Marion Rayburn, Agnes Ramsey, Margaret Rankin, Elizabeth Reid, Helen Reid, Marjorie Ritchie, Janet Robe, Janet Robertson, Janet Robson, Maisie Robson, Margaret Robson, Barbara Ronald, John Russell, Isabel Rutherford, Vegas Sanderson, Elspeth Seaton, Robert Scott, David Shankness, George Sherwood, Catherine Scobie, Marjorie Scott, Catherine Scott, Janet Scogrees, Agnes Sharp, Alexander Shepherd, George Sherwood, Bessie Simpson, Christian Simpson, Isabel Simpson, Margaret Simpson, Grisal Sinclair, Isabel Suter, Catherine Suter, Christian Small, Janet Smith, Narelle Smith, Margaret Smith, Marion Smith, Agnes Spence, Elspeth Spence, Janet Steig, Christian Steedman, Marion Stevenson, Catherine Stewart, Marie Stewart, Nicole Style, Isabel Style, Janet Stout, Janet Simpson, Elspeth Taylor, Margaret Taylor, John Taylor.